Hi, good evening from Kuala Lumpur, and good morning to our listeners who are outside the Asian region, especially our listeners from the Middle East, as well as Europe and beyond. It is our pleasure today to share our next Let's ID Talk series from the Asia Pacific University, Kuala Lumpur. And it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today. Our guest speaker is no other than Dr. Jihan Osman, whom I had the pleasure to meet while we were in a project together. And I like to say that I was very impressed by Dr. Jihan's knowledge in the field of instructional design and technology. And it's no wonder. She come from one of the best instructional design and technology schools. That is the from Indiana University School of Instructional Systems Technology. She did both her master's and her PhD there. I found out that we are alumni of the same university, so that was a double pleasure to meet Dr. Jihan in person. Dr. Jihan worked as a graduate assistant while she was at Indiana University, and then she continued her journeys back in Egypt. So she was with various universities in Egypt. Currently, she is senior advisor for teaching and learning innovations at the British University in Egypt. We were working very closely together with the UNESCO Hamdan University project on a postgraduate diploma in curriculum design and development, where we offered the program in Arabic. Of course, Jihan is an Arabic speaker as well. And they implemented the program that was designed by UNESCO and Hamdan University. Jihan is very involved in capacity building. She was the capacity building chair in Egypt and member of the advisory board UNESCO Dynamic OER Coalition. Okay, so today Jihan will talk to us, will share her experiences on instructional design post COVID-19. What are the implications and challenges? Over to you, Dr. Jihan.
Good evening in Malaysia, and good morning from Cairo. Thank you so much, dear Aptar, for inviting me to this very exciting opportunity. Thank you to the Asia Pacific University, and this is indeed a pleasure and an honor. I come today with some impressions based on my experience as an instructional designer, researcher, and professor during the pandemic, and impressions and questions about the implications of that pandemic. What have we learned? To me, it has raised some very important questions, but also suggestions for how we would move forward as a field and as instructional designers. So there will be components where I will ask our attendees to provide me with some ideas on, and if they could put that into the chat, that would be wonderful. And then we'll move on. So I see it a little bit as a discussion between me and other people who are here today and are interested in these questions. Thank you.
Just a moment. Let me bring those slides up, and then we could
So while we're waiting for the slides to be up, maybe you could just let me know where you are coming from and in what capacity where you involved with teaching and learning and instructional design during the pandemic. So if you could put that in the chat while we're waiting for the slides to come up, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Just a moment. I don't seem to be able to do that. Let me get over
Sure,
to.
sure.
Your slides are up, Dr. Jihan. You can carry on.
Okay, great. Um, so, um, so I know that some of the audience today is not from the field of instructional design. So I'll very briefly talk about it, just to anchor some of the key concepts that we'll be talking about later on. So next, please. So instructional design is really a field that is multidisciplinary in nature, like involving things like psychology, learning, management, technology, and many other areas. And it started with World War II, when there was a dire need to train huge numbers of soldiers on skills in a very short time. So it was addressing scale, time issues, and the idea that it had to be effective. It's also a very systemic and iterative process that involves variations of 5 steps, which are analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. And it is believed that using variations of that cycle in an iterative process through deliberate design and constant evaluation will lead to effective instructional solutions. So, deliberation and data driven methodologies are very important there. Next, please. And then I have a question, and it's a question that I asked myself during the pandemic as well. What do you think makes instructional designers valuable? People who pertain to that field and are experts in that field. So if you have an idea, maybe just drop a word or a sentence to tell me why do you think they are valuable? Okay. All right. So next, please. So usually, instructional designers have an advanced degree, which is either a master's or a PhD. They're very rigorously trained in their field, and they're often trained in a way that is different from other advanced programs or postgraduate degrees. So, part of it is really not only expanding their skill set, but also kind of creating an attitude and mindset that is often very different from other professionals in the area of curriculum and instruction. Next, please. And because they have such an extensive skill set and are such problem solvers and so much focus on creativity and systemic thinking, they often serve so many multiple um, functions within an organization in many kinds of organizations: the corporate world, the army, the military, schools, higher ed. Of course, I am kind of biased by the context that I come from in higher ed in the Middle East. And so they seem to be very versatile and capable. And that is part of their appeal. Next, please. And in the pre-pandemic world of online learning was limited in adoption. Of course, we have the big, online universities and programs, and we have MOOCs and all that. But in regular higher ed universities, online adoption was more limited, especially in the Middle East. And when you had online, you had deliberately planned modules that were created by a team of experts. Um, so that is an important thing to remember before we move into the pandemic. Next, please. And so the challenges were that people were not aware of this field in some areas of the world, including mine, that there is usually a shortage of instructional designer within universities. You have a limited number of designers that work with a huge number of faculty. So ratio between faculty and designers is pretty low, and that instructional design requires some very rigorous training, as we said. So instructional designers are sometimes hard to find. Next, please. And that is exactly what happened during the tsunami of the pandemic. The world within a day or two changed dramatically, and so changed the situation of learning and training in higher education, K 12, the corporate world, everywhere. Next. And suddenly, everybody wanted to go online virtually overnight in an unplanned way and immediately. So it was a daunting task for whoever would be part of this. But it was also an unprecedented opportunity, especially in my part of the world, to rethink education um, and to rethink how we provide education and so forth and so on. Especially like, what's the purpose of online and do we really need it? And is it a good option? Uh, so designers needed to act. So people looked for designers, and suddenly these became the most important and famous people in the university, for example. And designers had to act fast, find quick solutions at massive scale. And at that moment, there was a realization that there were not enough instructional designers to provide support to faculty. And so shortcuts had to be found or solutions. Next, please. So even for designers, this was new territory. So designers who are used to planning deliberately according to a timeline, with a specific people, and they have the luxury of time, space, and expertise, suddenly had to function in a completely different way. And at that time, even designers needed instructional support. And so we started having, Facebook groups or other communities that provided support. And a study showed that at that time, there was a need for, educational technology advice. Suddenly, people had to rather focus on pedagogy, which is something designers usually do. They had to find quick tech solutions that fit the context. And so that pushed them to an area that they're comfortable with, but not at that scale and that speed. Suddenly there was a demand for instructional designers, and they had to see how they are going to um, address all this need that they're finding. They needed peer support. They needed to share experiences and, find support for all the stressful situation that they were in, even though they were happy to be in the limelight. And of course, pedagogical advice related to COVID and how to function in a completely different context suddenly. And we'll go into that a little bit later. And so solutions had to be found. So people started thinking of just in time support or small bite sized micro learning experiences so that all these faculty can find the support they need. Originally, people thought of one size fits all training and support. That didn't work so well, and so alternatives had to be found. Um, Social communities started to appear on Facebook, like the famous pandemic pedagogy community, or like the instructional design emergency response network that consisted of volunteers, instructional designers who were volunteers who were there to provide faculty anywhere in the world with support. There were about 300 volunteers. So these were new ways of dealing with the pandemic. Next. At AUC, which is the American University in Cairo, where I worked at the time of the pandemic, there was massive training and support. So faculty, almost 85% of faculty, were received minimum one training just to get them functional within 2 weeks of the pandemic. And then everybody had to go online. Very quickly after that, Zoom was embraced. So synchronicity in a place, in a society or a context where internet access is not something to be taken for granted. But synchronicity seemed, or having synchronous tools seemed to solve some of the problems of making that sudden shift online. Um, Next, please. And so during that time, I worked with some colleagues from the Department of Computer Science into looking into that situation. And so we did a number of studies, and this was the team that I worked with, Dr. Nouri Saar, Aya Salama, and Nadine Tamish. And we worked on a couple of studies. The first one, next, um, tried to look at how faculty managed the transition after being trained and what influenced their decision and what were the processes they engaged in. And so we did in-depth interviews with faculties that were considered that they are innovative and are dealing well with the transition. And some of the results were very surprising, very new to us. The first one is that after the initial training, faculty became independent. They worked independently of instructional designers. So that was a surprise for us. The other thing is that they instinctively went through rapid cycles of trying out things and collecting like information to see whether it was working or not. And something extremely obvious was a huge concern for students and their well-being and their mental state, and that became a very important criterion in what decisions they took. So that was again surprising. These faculty members were generally very comfortable with trying out new technologies. And their areas of concern were assessment, engagement, and lack of experiential learning. And of course, they threw out these concerns to the community asking for answers. And that, again, I think is a widespread phenomenon. The concern for lack of experiential learning, assessment, and student engagement, and that is an area where instructional designers probably will have to focus on in the future. Um, and next. So So at that point, when I, was doing the analysis of this data, I was like, so to what extent are instructional designers important? And, were the strategies that were employed by these professors enough? I don't have the answer, but it was a very uncomfortable question. And I expanded on that question later on, as you will see. Next. And the other thing that we collaborated on was just in time collaborative artificial intelligence system. And so we said, if there are so few instructional designers within our university to support, how does it look elsewhere in other universities where there is even less support and expertise in our part of the world? And we started thinking about a system that is based on artificial intelligence. And we started thinking, how can we mirror the thought processes of an instructional design consultant? And to do that, we collected data from multiple areas. We talked to experts, we did analysis of data from the internet, we did interviews with instructional designers, and we tried to filter. We were focusing on STEM faculty at that time and on low resource technologies, because we wanted to address something that is localized to our situation of inconsistent internet access and so forth. Next. And so our recommender system was based on three main pillars. Next, please. That it provided customized solutions based on the feedback that was given by faculty initially. So it was tailored kind of to profiles, and it tried to mirror through the chatbot a consultation with an instructional designer, and that the feedback given by faculty on the chatbot would go into the system again to make it more intelligent and more successful in providing effective solutions. So we tried that out with a small group of faculty, and the results we got were quite promising, but also positive for instructional designers. So next, please. Um, so when we did the usability survey, most of the faculty said that it was useful and easy to use. They liked the chatbot. They found that interactive and user friendly and engaging. They said that that the recommendations of the system were of good quality, but they were not detailed enough. They did not feel that they could take that recommendation and immediately apply it into their classroom. And this is where they felt, there was a need for this very important person called the instructional designer. So that was another very interesting experiment that we did. That again, led us to think about, what is it about that partnership between the instructional designer and and faculty member that is important for effective design. What are the components that cannot be taken over by technology? So that is still a question in progress. But the answer is definitely of some value given how few instructional designers are available, especially in low resource contexts. Next, please. So yes, So, scalable mechanisms for instructional design. Next. Next slide, please. So, to summarize, a lot of the impressions that I got during the pandemic was that instructional designers are few. In my part of the world, this is when we started getting aware of the importance of instructional design for online learning. Rapid development was something that became very important during this time. Solutions had to be rapid and at scale. That there was this very renewed care for students. Like, people started talking about the pedagogy of care, of humanizing the whole experience, and considering the needs, the psychological needs of students. So that was definitely a change. And a renewed concern about the engagement, student engagement, that students were there mind, body, and soul, and not just a screen with a name. And of course, assessment. What assessments are fair, exams, and all that. That was another very huge debate that came up as a result of the pandemic. And that instructional designers also need continuous professional development and support. So all these were, things that came up. Next, please. And so, how does the world look now that the pandemic has settled in a way and could possibly be here to stay? Um, so, the problem with handling things through the pandemic and being able to survive rather than drown gave some people the idea or the misconception that things were going well. But rather than that, we were really in a situation where we were on a life raft rather than a five-star cruiser, and that is one of the hugest concerns. So the non-expert looked at everything that was happening, the remote emergency teaching, as online learning, believing that this is online learning, and this is extremely dangerous because the main tenets of online learning is really deliberate, planned, designed by experts, and where every component is really thought of and prepared for. Very different from what we saw during the pandemic. And so decisions are being made based on that experience that are not based in enough evidence. So there is no evaluation or not sufficient data to determine the, the learning losses or the learning gains that happened during that experience. There is no solid data to say whether all the experiments succeeded, and to what extent they succeeded, and where do we still need to work. Um, so like differentiating between that, making that clear that this is not regular online learning is one of the messes that we need to clear. Other messes is that we now have these systems that are kind of working, but are really just like mix and match, fix it up, quick fixes, but they're not really systems that you want to take for the long run. And the problem is convincing those who do not know that this is the case, and convincing people that we might really want to consider establishing long term systems that are more based in principles that ensure effectiveness. So, this is part of it, the misconceptions that have resulted from the pandemic. But there are other things. The pandemic showed something, really pushed amplified inequality, whether it's the Arab world or disadvantaged communities in the developed world or everywhere in the world. Actually, there were those who were disadvantaged by the pandemic. Of course, the most obvious one is access to technologies. Those who have internet, those who don't, those who have advanced technologies, those who don't, refugees, of course, um, poor people, the poor and the disadvantaged, who suddenly found that just being on the internet was an extreme luxury for them, and they had to choose between feeding their children or being on the internet to continue learning. Residents of rural areas who did not, or remote areas who do not have access again to the internet, girls in socially conservative families. So that was a concern in the Middle East, for example. Older learners who do not have the digital skills, and so on and so forth. So the question is now, what do we need to focus on as instructional designers now that we have to prepare for a world that is very different from what we were originally trained for? What skills do we need to acquire and what attitudes based on our experiences during the pandemic? And I'm wondering whether, some of the things are that we really need to put equity and accessibility on the top of our list of criteria when we think of thinking of solutions. Something that we need to embrace more is the framework of universal design for learning that ensures accessibility for everyone. We also need to think of flexible and lean solutions that fit the context of situations like the pandemic, and a more human centered approach. So, the pandemic really pointed out the importance of psychological factors and well being, which became a very obvious concern with our students and faculty and instruction designers. And last, I think speed and scale. Things We need to think of models that function at scale and function fast. And so I'm thinking more of modified model, and I started to think of frameworks that were within the field and outside the field. And so the first model that I thought might be important for us to think about is agile instructional design. So this is usually associated a lot with the corporate world, with software design, but maybe we need to think of it more within higher education. The idea of sprinting, of going faster, of making less complicated, more quicker testing, and rather than comprehensive testing. The other framework that I think might be very important at this point in time, past the pandemic, is design thinking. Please, next. So, design thinking is another framework that comes from, um, again, the industry, and focuses on human centered design, really putting the end user in mind and making him or her part of the process. Um, and it is very I mean, there are variations of this model, but the gist of it is focusing on human needs, reframing problems, and thinking of quick and varied solutions. So it has, five, it depends on the model, of course, where you're doing that, but basically it has empathize, that you start with empathy, and then you redefine and reframe the problem based on that empathetic analysis, and then you start creatively going wild with thinking of every idea under the sun, and doing that with teams that are very varied and diverse, prototyping quickly, testing quickly, and like you do not you quickly like test things out and see if it works or not. So I was thinking if we would, kind of use design thinking with Adi, what would it add? So Adi is our, kind of like very core model within instructional design, which is analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. So in many ways, the design thinking process overlaps with Adi, but I think it pushes it a little bit further into ways that are um, in line with what we learned from the pandemic. So in ADDIE, we do a lot of analysis that is very objective, often in nature, looking at the context, looking at the learner in terms of skills, needs, goals. So kind of very operational analysis. But design thinking and through the stage of empathy adds a dimension that I think is very important at this time. It's the idea of knowing the learner and their problems and their pains as a human being. And that while we think of solutions, we put that more comprehensive view of our learner in mind. Um, and then defining the problem. So, instructional design is very good at kind of defining the problem and seeing, what is really needed within that context. Um, instru- Design thinking would add the element of like, yes, all this is fantastic, but let's add the humane dimension. Let's do that empathetically. So that I think would be great too. Ali often thinks of one solution. Design thinking says no, let's have multiple groups. Let's have as many stakeholders as possible. And let's have many solutions that we try out very quickly and rapidly, that we prototype very quickly, that we test and evaluate, and then we move forward. So these are things that I think would add to the ADDIE model in terms from design thinking and agile thinking. So I think in the future, we might want to focus as instructional designers on multiple things. The prioritization of our learners as human beings. Again, going online and discovering that people have different needs. We have to rethink personalized learning. Something else that happened during the pandemic was that in the need for speed and access to the majority, people had to think of rather than having access to traditional content in terms of textbooks and pre-prepared materials, people started curating content that was accessible. And one trend that became very obvious during that period was using open educational resources and open software and open textbooks and so materials that were free to use, but were also materials that one could adapt to one's context easily without any financial or technological burden. So that was another thing that became important during the pandemic, and it's part of this toolkit that we as instructional designers would now use more often uh, with our clients. Mobile learning, of course, in my part of the world, mobile penetration is much higher than at home internet. And so it was important for us to think of solutions that would work with students' mobiles. Depending, of course, again, it's an issue of like not everybody has access to smartphones, but generally speaking, in the MENA region, in Africa, there is this is one area where that provides opportunities. New learning realities during the pandemic. There was huge concern about our students learning things theoretically, not being in physical labs, not going to the field with their architects or scientists or archaeologists, and people started thinking of alternatives to field work and experiential learning. And so, of course, there were no immediate solutions, but thinking about virtual reality or augmented reality or other alternatives that would offer interaction to something like reality, given the constraints of social distancing. Another thing that became very important because of speed and time was the idea of microlearning, that you focus on giving people what they need at the time they need. Kind of, it's like the idea that we used to talk about a lot and talk about more in the corporate world is just in time training. So, microlearning, so, infographics, very short lessons that, notifications on the cell phone. These are ideas. So microlearning is growing. The situation of the pandemic, the psychological impact of the pandemic, um, re-emphasized the importance of social learning and collaboration online. So I call it, in a sense, breakout sessions became very important. But of course, these are more sophisticated options, but we need to think of simpler ones like WhatsApp or other alternatives that are leaner technology and more accessible. Gamification, again, engagement was a huge problem during the pandemic. And so the idea of making learning fun and engaging again. So gamification is not that we have to depend on games, but that we have to um, add elements to our learning opportunities that have gaming elements in terms of that they engage and thrill our learners. Of course, rapid development, and I talked about that a lot. And finally, measurement and analytics. So we live in the time of data, and we need that data to tailor, to personalize, to monitor our experiments, our rapid experiments, our rapid unplanned experiments. So I think these are all areas that, I mean, are not entirely new, but there is a new importance given to them based on our experiences during the pandemic, whether it's locally or globally. And I think these were some of the ideas I had, some of my reactions, and there are some pending questions. So, that I still have. To what extent are instructional designers important for quality instruction? I think they definitely are, and I feel the difference of working with an experienced, well trained instructional designer. There is definitely a difference. But what is that difference? And how do we address the shortage of instructional design expertise, especially in low resource contexts? And what elements of the partnership between an instructional designer and a professor cannot be overtaken by other scalable solutions like artificial intelligence or whatever else? And so these are some of the questions that I have for myself and for you. If you'd like to answer some of these questions, or if you have questions um, that are not not related to these that you have for me, I'd be more than happy now to answer them. And thank you for listening to my reflections. So I see some of the comments now. Um, so any lessons
Yeah.
about yeah, I mean,
I,
I don't know. Akhtar, would you like to manage the questions or should I
yeah,
just look through the comments?
I think what will happen is Jonathan will be, posing those questions. I think there are a couple of remarks and comments, and questions as well. So let's see how that is. Let's go by, by the ones that were presented earlier.
Okay.
So Jonathan, could we take it from the beginning? The kind of questions that were posted or comments that were posted, please? I think there were a couple of very interesting ones. So let's start with Karin Sharawi. Karin Sharawi said, how did faculty react to advice shared by instructional designers? Uh, could you address them, Jihan?
Sure. So I think that that the pandemic, was kind of like a shock that changed people's attitudes towards a lot of things. So people were suddenly open because they knew that they would either, that there was no other way. It was you go online or you drown. There, people, our faculty, for example, were not given any other options. So they started being open to anyone who could help them. And of course, instructional designers at, for example, at the American University in Cairo, through the Center for Learning and Teaching, were there the first people to respond to this panic of suddenly having to go online. And so I think this was a dramatic shift, a dramatic psychological shift in terms of openness, in terms of willing to listen and willing to experiment that I have not seen before. And I've been monitoring, and working with faculty for a very long time. And so there was something very different happening. And this is why I see the pandemic as an opportunity, not just as a disaster.
That is very interesting, Jihan. At the Asia Pacific University, we happen to have quite similar experiences with faculty. In fact, leadership were more than willing to adopt instructional design very quickly. I think they saw the gap that needed to be filled up.
Mm-hmm.
So even at the Asia Pacific University, there was a high interest in instructional design throughout the university, and we were very glad about that.
Yeah.
Let's go on to the next one. Sally Abdel Aziz said, how can any educator cope with pandemic pedagogy if not entirely comfortable with using technology? Very interesting question.
I think this is what we saw at AEC. There were, prior to the pandemic, there were faculty members who did not even use email, and out of principle refused to use technology, believing that access to technology would kind of water down the learning experience. So we had a lot of faculty who fell into that category of being uncomfortable with technology. And I think this is one place where an instructional designer is really important, because I often see that the instructional designer is the cheerleader, the psychologist, the supporter, the person who gives the faculty member something that they can work with and have ownership of. It might not be the best, it might not be the latest, but it's something that the faculty member would feel comfortable with, and then they would give them the means that they could use that. The problem with the pandemic, of course, was that it had to happen in scale. And so that is a problem, because you didn't have time to support and think of a tailored experience. You didn't have time as an instructional designer, because you had so many faculty members to work with. I think one thing that helped was the initial training in functional technologies that are very simple, that might not be very attractive or sophisticated. That was something that helped faculty. The other thing that really helped faculty was that the university decided, after going asynchronously, to go synchronously through the Zoom. And that helped a lot of faculty kind of cope, even I would say psychologically, with the situation. Zoom was very user friendly, and it gave them the idea, at least the superficial feeling, that this is very similar to what they had in class. At least they would be live. Of course, later on, when it kind of sunk in, they discovered that it's not that similar and that they miss a lot of things in terms of engagement. And then that is when a lot of faculty started asking questions. How can I get my students engaged? Suddenly they became aware of engagement, which was before the pandemic. You would have to convince faculty of the importance of engagement. But once they were online, they suddenly felt that gap and started asking the question, what can we do about engagement? I want to feel that my learners are there. And that, I think, is another fantastic opportunity that happened as a result of the pandemic and going along.
Very nice. And in fact, we also did a survey with almost more than 2,000 students. And surprisingly, nothing was mentioned about technology. It was more of what you said. It was like engage us in, don't just, give us the content and the facts, but, make us do something, make us say something, interact with us and stuff like that. Nothing on technology. It was still just the basic engagement issues about creating the correct activities, assessing them. You can use simple technologies to just assess the learners. Before we go on to the next one, I'd like to say hello to Hanin. Sorry, Hanin, I have been a bit busy listening into Jihan. It was such an interesting talk. And we also have Alanieta, who is from, no, Alanieta, you are from Fiji? Yes, from Fiji.
Oh, so
Sorry.
exciting.
She was my student, my Master of Instructional
Okay.
Design and Technology student 10, 15 years ago, and now I get to see her again. She has something to say. So Alanieta said, would AI spell the end of the ID profession? That's interesting again. If such recommender systems become more sophisticated. What do you have to say, Jihan?
Yeah, I mean, so when our team, like Nuri and I and her graduate students thought of this, this was a reaction to the need, to sudden need to have constantly someone to ask about what to do and not finding somebody to help you. And for some faculty member, just going on a Facebook and talking to a community that they don't know was not an option. And so we started thinking of something that would give faculty a sense of security, a sense of control. And so we started playing with this idea of using artificial intelligence to fulfill that need at a very basic level. Because personally, I'm totally convinced that an instructional um, designer's most important skills and weapons, in a sense, are the human aspect of that instructional designer. Is that they get to know that professor in terms of their fears, their strength, their dreams. And it's kind of like getting them psychologically prepared and open to trust you and take a risk that they were not willing to take. And so I don't think that an AI system at this point in time would replace this. But I think that in a situation of emergency, where everything we're talking about in terms of going through this process of building trust at a very human level is a luxury, then maybe more sophisticated AI system would help in such situations. where you do not have access. But as our group that we prototyped and did a usability test with said, it is a good start, but it's not enough for me to go further. I need more help. And so I guess that kind of, I mean, this is a very rudimentary system that we started. It was just the beginning. And hopefully, we want to see what our system will learn in the future from the feedback of faculty. So we'll see where that goes. We try to mimic the process of a consultation. We try to mimic the thinking processes and decision-making process that an instructional designer usually goes through, the questions they ask, the points they focus on, and we try to build the recommendation system around that. But we'll see how it goes. But it is a danger. So
Yeah.
yeah.
There are pros and cons, but
Right.
I'm more attracted to the pros of the AI system and how we can use that to benefit us. There's so much to talk about, but we have roughly about 4 minutes to the
Okay.
hour.
Okay.
I think Alanieta have a lot more comments that are very interesting. Maybe when you are free, you could read into them. And you have also shared your email and your phone number, so they could communicate with you directly as well.
Absolutely.
I think
Absolutely.
Sally has another question. She said, or another comment. We witnessed the breakdown of some apps a couple of weeks ago. So, how may this affect online education or ID if this reoccurred?
Well, I mean, I think as something that we always think about, you know, something that we never that every ID person puts in mind is a plan B. So you always have to have a toolkit that is full of plan Bs. And this is part of what makes an instructional designer is this idea of you have a toolkit that is full of surprises that you can use given the situation. So we always think of alternatives. We have to come up with alternatives to get things going. It's part of what it does. I had a question where someone said, after the pandemic, professors have used the video lectures that they recorded during the pandemic, and they're offering these to the students, and are saying that students should only come to class if they have questions. Otherwise, the lectures are online. And she actually is a friend of mine who comes from Canada, Vancouver, and she said, I mean, is this how learning will be after the pandemic? What can be done to change this? And I think this really touches on the misconception that I talked about before, is that people misconceived that this experience is a luxury boat when it's really a raft. And that is something that we will have to work on, making clear that this is not, even if you survived, this is not good teaching, and this will not lead to good learning. So I think that will be an area that the field has to work very hard on during the coming period.
Thank you, excellent, Jihan. We have another one. Antoinette, she's our regular participant. Thank you so much for joining us. She asks, what tests for evaluation in this model are suggested for evaluation before implementation? I'm wondering if you are referring to the design thinking model, Antoinette, or I'm not sure. But I think she's basically asking for evaluation. Evaluation
Evaluation of
before
students, or
implementation.
okay. Yeah, I mean, I think we saw that kind of happening. Of course, when it comes to technology, you can try it, quickly before implementing it. But in terms of the techniques And this is something that we saw our professors do. I mean, the ones who we would call adjusted well to the pandemic teaching, was that they would try out something quickly with their students and tell them, what do you think? Is this working for you? So the idea of asking students for feedback, not at the end, but immediately after trying something out, or thinking with their students, including their students in the decision-making process. What would you think would be the better technology to use? And so this, again, was very new for faculty. And so evaluating through participatory strategies of including others and quickly collecting data and being very ready to throw something out of the window, even if you invested in it, because it's not working. So, so I think it's a different way of functioning that we're not used to within our field of higher education. Um, so that is, I think, how evaluation is different today.
Jihan, there are lots of comments. For example, Allah said we are the salespeople ideas and can be a daunting experience sometimes, And I think Hanin is agreeing with you about design thinking. I think the humanizing part, the empathy part, I think those areas are very important now for us to consider, as you have aptly mentioned from your findings as well. Great idea. Antoinette said, great. Antoinette is from Namibia University of Science and Technology. She said, great idea, rapid testing at its best. We have a very, very engaged set of people here with you today, Dr. Jihan. And I hope all of you will connect with Dr. Jihan in case some of your concerns.
The questions.
In case some of your concerns have not been addressed, I know there are many there, and we just selected some for you to take them on, so that our participants could get a better picture of what was it like ID before, during, and post. I think people went through many phases. I think this was the only time during the pandemic instructional design became like the most important word. It was at the tongue of every other faculty member, and we are glad. And
the moment of glory.
Sorry?
The moment of glory. We were on the red carpet.
Yeah, and I do really think that doing things more rapidly, more agile, is the way forward. And we have the technology. We have those apps to assist us. And this is where I think our roles as instructional designers will also need to be tweaked a little bit more, so that we are in tune with the needs of the faculty. And faculty themselves, I think, are also becoming more adept, more intelligent with the tools. So instructional design and technology, I think, came up a few notches up, but then it came with its own challenges as well. I think that's what you were also trying to say, Jihan.
Yes, definitely. And it's a very exciting time, challenging both positively and negatively for us as instructional designers and as a field. But it's great to be in the limelight.
It just seems like there's no end, even at the Asia Pacific University. I mean, there is always more to be done in ID.
Absolutely.
We are glad. We are actually coming up with a lot of templates now to assist our professors at the university.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
that's wonderful. So thank you so much for being here today, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Aptar and the Digital Learning Hub, for hosting me. I was happy to learn from your questions and share my reflections and my concerns. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful day wherever you are. I'm very excited about Fiji and Namibia and, of course, my friends from Canada. So thank you for waking up so early to be part of this.
Yes. So yeah, again, Dr. Jihan, we really appreciate your time, your effort, and to be with us in these very important discussions. And may you have a wonderful day ahead. And we thank all the participants who came on board and co-participated, responded, gave your comments, and shared your own ideas with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.